Baltic states is they're justified in being very concerned about potential Russian aggression against their countries. And ultimately, if the United States makes a strategic mistake of of rewarding the Russians and justifying their annexation of Crimea, then it calls into question our wherewithal and our resolve to decisively defend the Baltic states and our other treaty allies. My name is George Barros, and I am the Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead and the Russia Team Lead at the Institute for the Study of War.
In the last few days, we've had President Trump criticizing Zelensky over Crimea going to Putin. We've had many reports suggesting that Crimea has been dominated by Russians for a while, and it's more of a symbolic suggestion of imperialism. Do you agree with this?
I don't think we should de jure recognize Russia's illegal annexation and seizure of Crimea. And that is just for selfish geopolitical reasons that pertain to the U.S. interests. Look, if we fundamentally treat Crimea as a referendum on and this is a term that's become cliche, but the liberal international rules-based order, then we open up Pandora's box and we risk going back to another new international system where might does make right. Borders can change. You can salami slice your neighbors and permanently change the territories of different countries. And as long as you can just weather the sanctions or the political taboo that might generate, and if you can hold that out for a decade and then cause some more problems, you will ultimately be rewarded and your actions will be ex post facto legitimized. I think that's a terrible strategic precedent because it is akin to reopening a new kind of security architecture, not only in Europe, but globally, that is not going to be conducive to peace, prosperity, and development, and will actually reward risk takers and revanchists who seek to expand their power, like the states of 18th century Europe used to a long time ago. From the American perspective, I think it's a very poor decision, given that the United States recognizes Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia itself has recognized Ukraine's territorial integrity in numerous treaties that Russia conducted with Ukraine. And for us to acknowledge and renege on that would be a massive blow to American credibility and prestige.
So there you mentioned about borders changing. In the past, Putin has openly stated that he believed the Baltics belong back in Russia's sphere of influence. How likely is it that the Baltics would be his next target?
So I think the Russians are very clearly setting conditions to prepare to be able to wage military operations against NATO's eastern flank and against the Baltics. I can't tell you the time or the place. Several Baltic countries have put forward through their own intelligence services assessments that the Russians might be ready to invade us or conduct a military operation in 3 years or 5 years. Some have said even 10 years. I'm less sanguine about that timeline. I actually think that the Russians, if there were to be an operational pause in Ukraine and they rapidly redeploy their forces that are currently tied up in Ukraine back to the Baltic states and into Belarus, then we could be looking at a potentially much shorter timeline. But look, the Russians in their rhetoric are setting information conditions to justify, manufacture informational conditions to justify invading and seizing the Baltic states. The Russians have their whole historical Russian lands narrative. They have their Russian world, the Ruski Mir narrative, which Putin explicitly defines as having very concrete borders. The Ruski Mir is the union of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, which includes the Baltic states. It also includes Finland and parts of eastern Poland. But rhetoric aside, the Russians are taking marked military reforms and incorporating lessons learned from their war in Ukraine so that they can fight wars better. It was a massive indication for Russian intent when in 2024, the Russians basically doubled their command staff bandwidth that is targeting NATO's eastern flank. This is going to get a little technical, so for that, I ask you to forgive me in advance. But the Russians have essentially combatant command equivalents. They're called military districts. And there used to be a singular Russian military district that had an area of responsibility basically going from near the Arctic, close to Finland, for the Baltic states going down to Poland and parts of northern Ukraine. It was called the Western Military District. Well, the Russians in 2024 dissolved that military district and split it up into two military districts, each with a command headquarters and, likely each having its own air army and each having much more command staff and all of the various different intelligence services and planning services and everything that you would expect for a combined command. And this is quite significant because what the Russians have realized is that in their warfighting in Ukraine, command and control and bandwidth and having too few commanders or commanders that have a very large span of control has been a real inhibitor on the Russians from being able to effectively use forces. And so what they're doing now by building new headquarters, by essentially layering in more middle management to run the Russian military more effectively, and doing it so that you now, instead of having a commander with one single area of responsibility spanning from basically Finland to Ukraine, you now have two commanders, one who can focus on the Baltic states, one who can focus on Poland. And that is not a defensive move. That is a posture that's designed to increase the Russian military's ability to more effectively manage forces on the periphery. In addition to the military district reform, we know that the Russian military seeks to abandon its previous obsessed objective of having basically a lean, small, mean, effective, modern, all professional military force. And instead, they're actually having a back to the future moment and reconstituting a new version of the Russian military that looks more like the Red Army of Soviet infamy. Back in 2023, then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced intent that the Russian Federation should form, I believe, 17 new maneuver divisions, a division being a unit of about, roughly speaking, 10,000 people. And this is really significant because the previous Russian ground forces up until that point have been based around not divisions, but brigades, a smaller unit between 2,500 to 5,000 people. And so what the Russians have realized is actually they cannot be sort of the small version of America. They cannot have a professional, lean, mean fighting force based around brigades, which can accomplish their tasks effectively. What they realize is actually, we need to have a lot more mass. Russians can only achieve their battlefield objectives through fighting the way that the Russians, very crudely speaking, fought World War II, the way that the Russians thought that they would fight against a conventional war against Europe in the Cold War with, masses of many, many people, albeit less professional. And the Russians are now actually retrograding to that concept. And I expect that many of those 17 new divisions that are going to be stood up over several years, and especially on a faster timeline if the war in Ukraine comes to a premature conclusion, many of those are going to be based, I suspect, in Belarus, in Western Russia, on the border with NATO. Why would you need more command staff, control staff bandwidth in any event? And they will likely be postured against the Baltic states. So the third point is also the Russian gains in Belarus. Belarus has been transformed into a Russian outpost and is all but annexed in the last 5 years. I mean, we have gone from 2020, when we had British Royal Marines conducting exercises jointly with the Belarusian airborne forces at the Losovito training ground just a few kilometers from the Russian border, to now, just this past few months, Putin and President Lukashenko ratified a agreement which allows Russia to build new military bases in Belarus, which Lukashenko for decades had been resisting and denying the Russians to be allowed to expand a permanent military presence in Belarus. I mean, that's a massive strategic inflection. And of course, when you have Russian freedom of movement, when you have permanent units based in Belarus, when Belarus has basically been demoted to all but annexed in name only for the Russians, it is now a massive lodgment that can be used to geographically isolate the Baltic states. So when we look at the grand strategic outlook, the Russians are manufacturing the claims and the rhetoric necessary to justify an invasion of the Baltic states, like how they did for Ukraine in the years leading up to 2014 and the 2022 war. They are expanding their command staff bandwidth, which will improve Russian force projection capabilities and hopefully, for the Russian perspective, in the Russian conception, evade and avoid the command and control bandwidth and bottleneck issues they faced in Ukraine. And also, the Russians are expanding the size of their conventional force, their planned end strength for their force, and they now have freedom of movement and the ability to project from Belarus, which is something that they never had before. And so, for these reasons, I think the Baltic states is they're justified in being very concerned about potential Russian aggression against their countries, and ultimately, if the United States makes a strategic mistake of saying of rewarding the Russians and justifying their annexation of Crimea, then it calls into question our wherewithal and our resolve to decisively defend the Baltic states and our other treaty allies, because we will have proven to Putin that actually you can break international law, you actually can seize a chunk of territory, and if you just play your cards right, you threaten us enough with massive retaliation, you might indeed actually be rewarded for it.
With regards to the Russian expansion of military personnel, how effective is that, seeing as we've seen a lot in Ukraine, the idea of meat grinder tactics, of a massive loss of Russian military troops?
Yeah. So the Ukrainians right now have developed the meat grinder. The Ukrainians they know how to fight against the Russians. They've been doing this for 3 years. They have proliferated a very lethal system of interconnected sensors, drones, crude weapons to be able to essentially destroy and strike any Russian that enters within a 10 to 15 kilometer zone of the front line. And the Baltic states do not have that system at scale. And so, if Russian forces today were to apply the same tactics that they're using in Ukraine, and if the Baltic states were to leverage the best possible scenario, the kinds of tactics the very small, comparatively small Baltic states defense forces could muster, I think you actually you're likely looking at a much more decisive outcome in favor of the Russians. Moreover, if the Russians have an opportunity to regroup, reconstitute, fix themselves after extricating themselves from the mess in Ukraine, uh, incorporate lessons learned from what did not work in Ukraine and how can that work better in a future war, then I suspect you're going to see a very big difference in the war in the Baltic states. So, for example, in the first day, or the first 48 hours of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February 2022, Russian forces in the first 24 hours managed to project north of 20 kilometers and get to the outskirts of Kharkiv within the first day. Within 3 or 4 days, there are areas of the front line where they had gone 80 kilometers, 90 kilometers. I mean, they were going very, very far, very, very fast. And the Ukrainians were able to leverage the operational depth that they have for a defense in depth to be able to attrit those Russian forces because they stretched the lines too long, too fast. But the Baltics geography do not favor that sort of defense. The Baltics don't have operational depth. They cannot conduct a defense in depth. And if you assume that with a fresh fighting force that can, leapfrog 25, 50 kilometers within a day, 2 days, you apply those distances on the map in the Baltic states, that's actually really not favorable. Because you actually can get a lot of the Baltic states at that sort of rate. And the Baltics don't have the ability to put that kind of resistance up. This is a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. I mean, the terrain's different. You don't have the open sort of fields and steppes that the Russians are able to advance very quickly through in Ukraine that you have in the Baltics. Baltics have a lot of forests and different terrain that's harder to work through, a lot more canalizing terrain. But ceteris paribus, it seems like the Russians are in a place to really take their experience in Ukraine and not face the kind of meat grinder. Because the nature of the fight and the nature of the combatants would be so much different.
Should the Baltic states prepare, or how could they?
So the Baltic states' strategy for how to resist Russian aggression against their countries is essentially do their best to buy time, be a speed bump. They will be occupied, which is why a lot of Baltic strategies are based around irregular warfare and how to actually establish an insurgency following the occupation of significant portions of the Baltic states, and then wait for the NATO relief force to then come fight its way and organize itself through Poland and go up north into the Baltic states and liberate them. They should prepare. They should get ready, but they have to prepare in the correct ways, in the proper ways. there was a recent report that came out. I forget in which outlet was. Maybe it was New York Times or a different one. I don't remember. But it was essentially talking about how the Baltics are building a Maginot Line. I mean, they have the series of field fortifications that they're digging. They're building these concrete bunkers and pillboxes and all this stuff. And that's, in my assessment, not the correct lessons learned to take away from the war in Ukraine. The Russians will be able to outmaneuver or blast their way through a Maginot Line. What the Baltics need to invest in is doing their best to recreate the type of sensor-based, drone-based kill chain and very effective denial area that the Ukrainians have created with Ukrainian drones. And it's also a lot cheaper, by the way, than building a Maginot Line and staffing it. And so the Baltic states should prepare. They should try to deter such an attack, and if necessary, buy the amount of time necessary for the NATO alliance to come free them. But they have to prepare in the correct ways. And preparing for previous wars or using outdated tactical or operational concepts, which are not going to be effective at defending against the Russians, is not the right way to do it. And frankly, the way to learn how to defeat the Russians or effectively deter against the Russians is to look to what systems are the Ukrainians using now that are putting a lot of Russian soldiers in the grave.
George Barros, thank you very much.